Welcome to the video on Vicarious Liability. First thing you need to do with this tort is establish the tort committed. So we're looking to make the employer liable for the tort of an employee. Now this is usually going to be negligence or negligent misstatement, for example, and the first thing you do in the problem question is deal with that with the original defendant. Once you've done that, establish is the defendant an employee or an independent contractor. Now they will be liable for the tort of an employee but not an independent contractor. The first test to think about is the control test. Now the easiest way to think of this is the old master-servant relationship, or indeed making more than one employer liable. Now it's very difficult these days to prove that test, so we move on to the integration test. Now this means, are they integral to the business? Now usually they will be integral to the business, of course, but then some relationships will not be. So you might compare this from, for example, a taxi driver to a chauffeur driver, or a freelance journalist to be an independent contractor compared to a journalist employed by the newspaper. One of the most modern tests then is the multiple test. That's the next one we need to look at, and this is really established through a number of different ways. The best way to think of this is to come from the test from Ready Mix Concrete and the Minister of Pensions and National Insurance. Now this isn't necessarily a vicarious liability case, but it helps establish that idea of who an employee is. Now what we can glean from this then is the first thing we need to think of is the employee, or does the employee agree to provide a work or skill in return for a wage? Now in most cases that's going to be yes. The employee then will expressly or impliedly accept the work is subject to some sort of control of the employer. So obviously the more control they exert, the more likely they are to be an employee. The less control they exert, the less likely they are to be an employee and therefore an independent contractor. The third thing to do is have a look at the question. So what does it say about the status of that employee? And take them all into consideration and weigh them up. Are there more factors indicating employment or more factors indicating independent contractor? Now look at all factors then. So they might have a regular wage, a uniform, they get deductions of tax and national insurance, they get more control, more instructions. That would lean to being an employee. Also look at the factors in the scenario which may indicate self-employment or independent contractor status. So for example, they get paid by a lump sum, they have invoice-based pay, they pay their own taxes, use their own tools, choose when they work, and so on. Then make a balanced judgment. Are they employee or are they not? Now a trick to remember, if there's a full question, then obviously they're going to be an employee because you're going to want to have to talk about whether they're doing the job at the time. So you're okay sitting on the fence and say they're more likely to be an employee and move on with your question. For this, if the multiple test, of course, doesn't establish the results you need them to, or the triggers aren't there, so it doesn't discuss any factors of their employment, then look at the latest test, the akin to employment test. Now this test comes from a variety of cases from 2012, usually involving abuse. Now the test here is that the relationship is akin to employment, or akin to that between an employer and an employee, so it's fair and just to impose vicarious liability. So laid out in various claimants in the Catholic Welfare Society in 2012. There were a whole tranche of cases here in terms of the different rules, but we'll use this to try to establish and help us establish what akin to employment is. So 5 key considerations then. The employment is more likely to have the means to compensate the victim. If this is true, the more likely to have a akin to employment relationship. The act will be committed as a result of the activity being taken on behalf of the employee on behalf of the employer. And what we've got here is then they're doing the job as a result of what they're doing for the employer. And of course, the employee's activity is likely to be part of the business of the employer. The employer, by employing the person to carry out the activity, will have created the risk. So it's an entrepreneurial risk of the act by being committed by the employee. So there's more of a risk that person doing a thing when they employ them. And then the employee will, to a greater or lesser degree, have been under control of the employer. So again, more of these which are satisfied, the more likely the relationship is akin to employment. So they don't have to be in employment. We can call this quasi-employment. Once we've established that the person, the tortfeasor, is employed or in quasi-employment, we need to consider were they doing the job at the time they did the original tort. So once they did the negligence, were they doing the job at the time, for example. And so there are some broad rules. Now we've got one here, the close connection test if they do a criminal act. Now generally the employer will be liable, and you can see plenty of cases on this, notably some new cases involving Morrison's and various claimants, for example. However, if you're doing AQA, it's very unlikely they're going to, in the big exam question, in the 30-mark question, for example, they're not going to put on a crime. And that's because there's a bit of crossover. Now, we do look at some torts, which are also crimes, but there's going to be no crossover on the paper. So this is going to be more a multi-choice or a short-form question if this appears on the paper. Now, you're just looking at closely connected test or close connection test. Now, an employee does a job, but against orders. Now, you're looking at negligence here. So they're doing something, but they are doing it in a way that they're told not to. Now, they will still be liable, except for cases where there are lifts. Now, an employee doing a job negligently, that is exactly the kind of thing you're going to be looking at. So they're doing the job negligently, that is when they're going to be liable. And just a quick note on the except for lifts, rather, this is lifts in a vehicle. And finally, an act authorised by the employer. So whether told to do something, even if it's in a negligent way, or if it's illegal, for example, the employer will still be liable, and that harks back to the idea of control. Now, if the employer is liable, then the employer must pay compensation to the victim. But the add-on is that it could be recovered from the employee under the Civil Liability Contribution Act 1978, in which they could deduct from wages, for example. Now, things which are not considered in the course of employment are things like a frolic of their own. So if the defendant goes on an unauthorised break, or they're on their own time, or travelling to work, for example, they're not considered to be doing their job at the time. We've also got a tort committed outside of the scope of employment. So if they're paid to do one thing, but they're doing another, like for example, if they're paid to collect bus fares, in some old cases, then of course you have the idea that they shouldn't be driving the bus, and so the employer will not be liable in those circumstances. We've also got then the tort of an independent contractor. This is just to round off the idea that they will not be responsible if they do not employ the defendant.